Guys, Masania finance bill. We are back again in that time in the country where everyone is having mixed feelings about our finance bill as a country. This is Politically Connected. I'm your host, Diana Ngao,
aka Madam Speaker, and I am Chaka Sichangi,
aka the Bishop. Today we're having an important conversation because wherever you are, as long as you're a Kenyan and you hear the word finance bill, you definitely have some mixed reactions around it. But then this is still an important bill that takes us through from one year end to another year end as a country. And with us in studio, we have a public intellectual scholar who specializes in corporate governance and public finance. He's not, if you've been with us for a while, you'd know that he's not a new face here. So we're so happy to have Professor Vincent Ongore with us. Karibu sana, Prof.
Thank you, Diana and Chaka.
Asante sana for joining us. It's been a year since.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Prof. A lot has happened since the last time we sat. When we convened here the last time, you gave us a very refreshing view into how our finance sector works from the government perspective. You told us, your journey into reaching the heights of finance, the journey you walked with the Kenya Revenue Authority. And in fact, when you joined, it wasn't the Revenue Authority. And you gave us some very rich insights, what it was like working under different presidents and their approaches and the things the economy were going through at various points in time. And so we invite all our viewers to go back and watch that episode. It was a very rich conversation. As we gather here today, a lot of questions are being asked. Sometimes those questions may not even have a strong foundation when they're being asked. They may not even come from a place of understanding, but they do come from a place of genuine anxiety about the direction of the country, genuine anxiety about the decisions that are being made about the lives of people. So people might not even know the questions to ask, but you can see that there's a sincerity in the questions that they're asking. As an expert who deals and engages with people from across the board, what is your reading of the room, your reading of the country? What are you seeing from where you are seated?
Thank you, Chaka. I think Kenyans are right in demanding answers and trying to understand what exactly the Finance Bill 2026 contains and what is in it for them. And this is because during the 2022 campaigning period, or is it called campaigneering or campaigns, a lot of promises were made. And of course, you expect that Kenyans should ask questions. These promises were made based on what the candidates read the situation to be at that time, or simply making promises because they wanted votes. But one thing that they didn't tell Kenyans was that the situation that they were in, that the country was in at that time, was such that about 67% of our ordinary revenue, that is income tax, VAT, excise, and customs duty, what basically is collecting by KRA, was going towards debt repayment, both offshore as well as domestic debt. But of course, they told us what they wanted us to hear instead of what we ought to have heard. And so Kenyans made decisions based on the promises, the manifestos. Now the reality came in. Once they were in office, they were not able to deliver as expected. And so Kenyans have every reason to ask questions. The reality today is that the government doesn't have much room to implement some of those decisions. Some of those promises that they made to Kenyans. because we have hardly 28 to 30% of revenues remaining to underwrite the cost of governance. Because about 70, 71, 72%, some people say up to 81%, if you factor in the interest expenses, right, is going towards debt repayment. And that is why you see in recent times Kenya is moving towards more domestic borrowing than external borrowing, because external borrowing, already we have about 64% of our external debt denominated in US dollar. Kenya is trying to redenominate some of it into other currencies like the Chinese yuan, which is not very which is not fluctuating a lot. And so we are saying that it is possible that in the long run we are going to deliver to Kenyans, but for the time being we cannot. And that is where the problem is, because the government is not telling Kenyans that they are not able to do what they promised to do because we don't have the money.
Yeah, I think I remember just short of after the 2022 elections, where the new administration had come in and the narrative was like, we found zero bob. We found zero bob. There was nothing in our coffers. And then now, shortly after that, we had the 2023 finance bill where we had some protests around it, but it was more politicized around the previous election. And then we had now the swell that was the Gen Z protest in June 2024, where we saw a bill that was passed, that was finally was once passed, then it was rejected, or rather the president made the decision to be like, no, we won't continue with this bill because the people have also spoken and said they don't want this bill. But who really bore this cost of that rejected bill? Was it the people who went to the streets to protest, or was it the people who actually made the decision to pass the bill?
It was an expensive affair.
It was expensive.
Because the 2024 finance bill had actually made proposals to increase additional taxes, really tax raising measures up to 346 billion shillings in additional revenue. And once that bill was scuttled, it means we had to look elsewhere to fill that fiscal gap. To date, that pivot is huge, because to date we are not able to to really get back the economy on its feet. That was huge, because we had to go to, immediately that happened, we actually had to get additional 1.1 trillion Kenya shillings to fill the fiscal gap, right? And that made it actually even worse, because remember the situation, the debt situation was already debilitating, and we got deeper and deeper into indebtedness. So that means that we cannot afford as a country to go that way again. We can't afford, because the ramifications of the 2024, scuttled bill are still with us. We are here to come back on track. And yet, finance bills are supposed to help us to achieve economic sovereignty, because a finance bill tells us this is what we want to do, and this is where we are going to get the money to do it. Whatever gap arises out of it, where our ambitions are higher than what we have, then we are talking about a finance or fiscal gap that we need to fill. Now, if we scuttle it again, it means we are groping in the dark. We really don't know where we will actually get the money to do our business. And yet, a country must have money to underwrite its cost of governance. We cannot stop security. Security cannot stop. We need to replenish our roads that are getting into, state of dereliction. We need to build schools. We need to stock hospitals, and we need to basically service, our social infrastructure. Without money, we cannot. And you can't blame Kenyans, as I said earlier, for wanting to know more about the finance bill because they are frustrated. Yeah. But their frustration then makes it difficult for them to even concentrate on reading the finance bill. They don't care what happens. And that is why a lot of people are talking about reject the finance bill, even without reading it. What I think should happen is government should come out and say, look, ladies and gentlemen, we are in it together. This is our problem. We don't have enough money. We inherited huge debt. We have been struggling. Actually, it's been a struggle. This regime has been struggling for as long as it has existed. That's why we came up with the fiscal consolidation efforts, which of course the demonstrations scuttled, and we cannot, as I said, we cannot afford it. We can't go that way again.
Highlighted something very pointed at the beginning of this conversation, and I'd like to maybe take us back a little bit to that, to a philosophical question of sorts. You highlighted that promises were made and people were essentially told what they wanted to hear instead of what they ought to have been told. My question, therefore, is, are we having a conversation as a nation? And you just stated that government should come out and say that we are in it together. But today, when we hear certain key officials from government speak, they seem to be responding to, understandably, various stakeholders, whether it's Mitumba, whether it's the pharmaceutical sector, whether it's the mobile telephony sector. They're speaking to stakeholders and, in a sense, even having elevated conversations. You see the public participation forums. It's good to see that they're there, but you're also seeing submissions that have to do with the wording, the particular wording of some provisions. And so a vast majority of Kenyans are, in effect, being left out of this conversation. And the question I have, other than whether or not we should have a conversation, does the government trust that Kenyans are intelligent enough to have this conversation so that they can actually then have this conversation with them? Or is it more expedient to have this conversation with the technocrats and the professional stakeholders, because they can then speak in a language and a register that is they deal with day to day, whereas having a conversation that takes a step back and bringing the whole adult population as much as possible to the same page would be a tall order. What would your take on that be?
Now, our situation is a little convoluted because we are mixing economic debates with political debates. And the level of partisanship, particularly political partisanship, that goes into economic debates makes it difficult for us to decipher what we really need to be talking about. Now, there are facts that are given about the running of an economy. One is that the government needs taxes to run this economy. And two, that taxes will come from citizens, all right? From economic activities that citizens are engaged in. By citizens, I mean both individuals as well as, legal citizens. I mean, legal persons who are citizens, companies, and the rest of it. Now, the reality is that Kenyans need to be co-authors of their finance bill, right, with the government, so that as stakeholders in all this, in the whole process, they cannot countenance a situation where there's a finance bill that they do not know about. But there is a screen that makes it difficult, a screen in front of Kenyans that makes it difficult for them to participate meaningfully in that debate. And that screen is political screen. The debate has been mediated by politics. And so it is extremely difficult to have a conversation especially at a time where or when the political landscape is very toxic. And yet Kenyans need to participate in that debate. I remember, just taking you back a little, when we were talking about the Constitution, that birthed the Constitution 2010, some people were saying Raila has read the Constitution. So we don't need to. It is playing out here now. Those who are pro the establishment see nothing wrong with the finance bill. Those who are against it, the so-called one-termers, see everything wrong with it without even reading it. And so until Kenyans decide that we want to remove partisan politics out of the debate, we are not going to go far. So I think Kenyans are willing to learn. And we cannot say that that Kenyans are foolish. They are not. The people who are taking them for a ride are politicians. And because Kenyans tend to trust their politicians, that is where the problem is. They tend to trust their politicians in a partisan way. They don't trust the establishment, but they trust, particularly politicians are in the position, tend to sway Kenyans to their side in terms of thinking, so that anything that government says, good or bad, to them looks bad. For example, the Finance Bill 2026 that is before us has some wonderful things that are supposed to pivot us towards economic sovereignty, where we are talking about using intelligent approaches to tax administration, where we are interfacing KRA systems with those of service providers and other taxpayers, so that tax administration becomes a data-driven process. Kenyans don't want to hear that.
Yeah, I remember most recently, Kenyans were getting WhatsApp messages from KRA.
Yes.
As a drive to just sensitize them that, hey, remember we are coming to the end of the financial year, make sure you've made your returns. But the general sense, as opposed to appreciating the reminder, was like, hey, wamenikujia hadi WhatsApp. There's just a fear that, oh my gosh, I'm being hunted, right? This is even before the budget conversation has come up. So there's already a fear that, look at them already coming for me, number one. Number two, it's that, how did they even get for people who either tax or avoiding or evading, it's how did they even get my WhatsApp number? So there's a general psyche of mistrust, and not only mistrust to the government in power, but also mistrust on the institution of Kenya Revenue Authority. What are your thoughts on that?
It is normal for citizens to mistrust tax administration because it raids your wallet. World over, it's a phenomenon that is not, it's not strange to us. But the difference, like if you look at Europe, look at the Nordic countries, their tax rates are in the region of 45%, 50%. And people celebrate it. And they celebrate it because there's a link between that tax that they pay and service delivery. And systems work, right? And because systems work, citizens don't complain. Now, the messages that you are getting from KRA are actually a reminder that you have a civic duty to perform as a citizen. But people look at it as, like, Ruto now wants our money. Tax is not about Ruto. Tax is about you and I, because it is supposed to underwrite social services for all of us. Public service is not about Ruto. Ruto will come and go, Ruto will leave, but this country remains. So I think the conversation we must be engaging in is that we need to take hold or get hold of our own take charge of the destiny of this country. But that requires patriotism. But patriotism doesn't come just because someone asks you to be patriotic. It comes when you see what your taxes are doing, see people are making it easy for you to live, services are being delivered, and systems are working. Look at the numbers. For example, diaspora gives us, I think, about 50 billion. It gave us, but more than 90% of it goes into consumption. Someone calls you, there's a funeral here. Someone is sick. Someone needs school fees. Why is it going into consumption? It's because our systems are not working. If they were working, you'd not need to raise funds for someone's child. Yes. So what we must begin to address as a society is systems should work. When they do, then we shall detach systems from whoever is running them. That way, then it makes work easier. We are able to evaluate performance, right? To what extent did you deliver, given that the systems are working. But when systems are not working, then we have a situation where the president walks to your village and then promises a road and messes up the budget and delivers a road. And for that reason, he's doing politics. And that road, for it, for that money to be availed to do a road, it means it must have been diverted from somewhere else. And so for as long as, look at what happens, for example, in a place like the United Kingdom. The minister in charge of the treasury, there are two people there. There's the person in charge of finance and planning, but there's also the person in charge of the exchequer. The finance and planning handles issues of the economy, the forecasting, and the rest. But the guy in charge of exchequer handles what comes in and leaves, our taxes and our debts. And those are constitutional offices. Until ours become constitutional offices, we will still be beholden to the presidency. And that is what the Constitution ought to have addressed. We must separate finance from exchequer and then make them constitutional offices. That way, then we can move. Until that happens, we will still have the president walking into your village, and you can't blame him because he wants your vote to say this is what we are going to give you, and he actually does because he can bully parliament to deliver. Right.
Maybe to take it in a bit of a slightly different direction, but I'm hoping we can come back to that point on the how the institutions are structured. For example, even looking at the principal secretaries that sit under National Treasury and that demarcation and what that tells us about how we are organized. But if we could leave that briefly and come back to sort of a devil's advocate question, but from a pro-government perspective. So as I ask this question, let's assume that we're seated here, we agree on patriotism. We agree that we love our country and we want the best for the country. And then we then say that being patriotic, we can agree on the objectives and what we want to achieve as a country. And having agreed on patriotism and objectives, when we have something like a national tax policy, there are no protests because it's a bit high level. We can agree on the principles. We can agree that it's a good thing to have a tax policy. The language is very nice and uses principles and even virtues. And then we then have a document like the medium-term tax strategy. And we don't have a protest about that one. We can agree that this is a general direction we should go, the principles.
Conversation about that. You don't hear it.
And the principles underpinning it are constitutional. They're derived from Vision 2030, from the tax policy. And now we have a medium-term strategy and the medium-term planning. And then closer to the year, within this 3-year window, we have a budget policy statement. And we say that these are the things we want to achieve. This is the direction we are taking. We have some discussions about it, some robust debate, but we don't have protests around it. But come the finance bill, and putting the politicizing to one side, there is a lot of genuine grievance, even from stakeholders who, even because some of the stakeholders are tax-paying Kenyans, corporate citizens, legal persons, as we've said. And they are saying, we can agree on the tax policy, we can agree on the strategy, we can agree on the direction we are taking, but where the rubber meets the road, we feel that you're being a bit unfair, even where we want to be patriotic. So for example, just 2 or 3 examples from this finance bill. We see that there's some measures from a procedural standpoint, some measures are being taken. One, fair administrative action. The taxman is saying, where there is a dispute, we will allow you to take it to appeal, granted. But before you appeal, we will take what we believe is owed as you do the appeal process. And of course, that is a real pain point, because what is being taken away is affecting business, it's affecting livelihoods, it's affecting, because you can't even have, assuming that the appeal is genuine from a justice perspective, you can't plan for such a measure. Let's take another procedural example where in this finance bill, the compliance window is being brought back from June to April. And now that means your compliance costs are much higher, because maybe now where you needed 1 or 2 people to do that work, you need to dedicate more resources to close that gap within a much shorter period of time, raising compliance costs. I'll give one last example and then we can address them together. This is about where the rubber meets the road, even when we agree on the working principles. You have this robust discussion surrounding, now this is more substantive and less procedural, VAT exempt versus VAT zero rated. And you have a significant number of things being brought, classified now under VAT exempt, which to many people that sounds nice, but actually it means it's increasing costs. Like now when we look at agricultural and pharmaceutical products, and of course that touches on a lot of Kenyans across the board. So coming back to the question I'm therefore asking is, even where we want to be patriotic and we want to support government and want to agree on the principles and objectives that are informing these choices, when it comes to where the rubber meets the road, can we understand where people are coming from with some of these seemingly painful measures that sometimes even seem a bit arbitrary? Because I doubt anyone would agree that, okay, take my money, when I finish appealing, we can now revisit.
Good. Let me start from the question of tax policy and then where the rubber meets the road. Take, for example, this house. There's the architectural design. That is the tax policy. Mm-hmm. But there is, where will I put the fireplace, and where will my seats be, and where will my dining place be? Now, those are bolts and nuts of tax administration. Now, the reason people pay attention to the bolts and nuts is that now they are beginning to see that they have arrived. When you are discussing tax policy, you are abstract. And a lot of discussions are confined to that space where economists are, tax administrators and experts. But tax raising measures actually come to your doorstep. They are saying that your chicken will go, right? Like, of course, in the colonial times. When they were talking about how much they want to raise, it was still abstract. But they are now telling you that your chicken will go. So people begin to wake up that actually we thought that was a discussion at intellectual level, but now they are here. Now, looking at the question you're talking about, VAT exempt and zero rated. When it is exempt, it means no VAT will be charged. And so that means you have your input VAT, but you can't do anything about it because you're not charging the VAT on the product, and nobody is giving you back what you paid. So it is actually expensive. As opposed to zero rated, where you're saying that you ought to have charged, right? But you did not. For example, in essential services, essential goods like Medicare facilities, you should actually charge because you got the input, but they are not allowing you to charge, but they will give you a refund, right? So that is actually a better deal than the exempt. Yeah. Now, when they begin to interfere with this, they're saying we are removing it from zero rated to exempt. It essentially means that they are doing away with refunds in a clever way. A lot of times, this hits business because there is money being held up there in the inputs, but nobody is giving it to you, and they are not allowing you to charge. So that actually is a discussion that, as I said, we need to be co-creators of our tax policy. And so participation, public participation, especially in by key stakeholders, so that they actually tell government this is exactly where the shoe pinches. And then government can, together with the stakeholders, look for a way of addressing it without killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And that is where our problem is, that we make these decisions somewhere up there. We are armchair tax administrators making decisions about tax without involving those who are actually going to pay it. At the end of it, we get the tax, but the taxpayer feels the pain. Now, the idea should be that we tax people in a way that does not kill their businesses. But that means we must begin by understanding the business models. How is it that this business is run? If we apply this kind of tax, how is it going to affect, the business? That way, then it is a win-win situation for both the government in terms of raising tax revenues and the business in terms of the going concern, philosophy. Okay.
I read your most recent article on the Daily Nation, where it's talking about the sovereignty budget. And my question is in regards to the balancing act of expanding the tax base while also providing service delivery, right? So from your earlier remarks, you said, we can't afford to reject this bill because we have debt obligations that we need to adhere to. But then so that's why we also need to expand our tax base, right? So now, in terms of how do we have that balancing act? And I think that's what's the biggest question in a lot of people's minds. We don't mind paying tax, but there's this balancing act in terms of this is whether it's 40% or 50% of my income given. However, how are we able to balance the act of now the reforms that are required to ensure that whatever comes to the Revenue Authority is not now misappropriated or pilferaged in different ways, especially now that this budget will meet us in a high election season between now to 2027 June. What are your ideas of what is a balancing act there? Because I think that's the biggest question. I'm I don't mind paying taxes, I just can't see them.
Now, we are in a very tricky situation, both for Kenyans generally and for the government. About 45% of our economy is cash-based. That means that traceability of transactions is difficult. So the government, actually the tax collectors, tax administration relies on the 45% of the economy that is, non-cash, that is formal. So what that means is that we are raising tax revenue from just about a half of the tax payers in the country. And for us to, deal with this situation, as I said earlier, we must first understand how, these businesses run, understanding the business models so that we bring them to the tax net and we are able to, make them, take responsibility or take their civic responsibility. That way, then we are going to have the money we want, reduce the tax rates for, the people who are easier to get, like employees and registered businesses who are actually carrying their unfair share of the tax burden. Now, the other thing is about situations that are not very good for the optics. What the Auditor General and the Controller of Budget keep talking about. They keep reporting about pilferage. Keep talking about malfeasance at all levels of government, and actually it's even getting worse with the counties. Now, our concern as Kenyans is that our taxes are being misused. And walking around, you can see people who have access to our taxes putting up massive buildings, businesses littered all over the country. And you look at them and say, that is so-and-so, that is so-and-so, this one works here, this one, and in government. So that is a situation that government cannot run away from. They must begin by not just talking about austerity, but ensuring that pilferage is reduced to nil so that Kenyans get value for the taxes that they pay. That way, I saw it when NAC came into power in 2002, and then the first thing they did was to put in place a tax amnesty. President Kibaki himself led the country by pleading to Kenyans to pay all their taxes and make this country free, tulipa ushuru tujitegemee, so that we gain financial independence by relying on our domestic resources to underwrite our expenses. Now, what I saw was that Kenyans were so optimistic about the new government that had come in place, and actually government demonstrated it at the initial stages, that they were actually serious about making a difference. You saw, interest rates coming down and people arresting policemen who were attempting to do this, and Kenyans were happy. And for that reason, the Kibaki administration said, pay your principal taxes and all the interest and penalties would be waived. And we saw it. Kenyans came in large numbers to do exactly that, and they paid. Simple lesson. Give Kenyans reason to pay their taxes. And optics, especially when people are living large, people who have access to our resources are living large when the rest of us can hardly have, a decent breakfast. That is a bad way of telling Kenyans how you're utilizing their taxes. And when you see Kenyans saying we want to reject this finance bill, it is not that they don't like the finance bill. They have absolutely nothing against it. Actually, what the issues in the finance bill that should warrant rejection are minimal. They actually want to reject it, if they will, and I hope they will not, on the basis that they cannot see the link between those taxes and the services being delivered. And again, as I said, politics has moderated this thing so that our politicians are always harping on what is not being done rather than what is being done. And it will require a bit of spin to tell Kenyans quite something, a lot of things have been done. But in this kind of political landscape where we are only talking about what has not been done, it is going to be very difficult, for Kenyans to see. Because as I said, Kenyans trust their partisan politicians more than the actual things that are going on in the ground.
Yeah, and maybe now that you've talked about that, in your opinion, this is a good finance bill. It's just a few things that need to be tweaked. One of something that has gone viral with the conversations of young people is the issue that in this finance bill, they want to increase the excise duty on mobile phones, especially at a time where we're seeing that a lot of young people are now using their mobile phones, internet as a way of earning a living. Now, how it communicates to them is that this is even more punitive. So what are your thoughts about that? I don't want to tell the audience what your article said.
and then maybe also as you answer that, I think there may also be an opportunity here to, with this instance, distinguish between the different types of taxes. The excise, the VAT, so that because what people hear is an increase of 25%. But you see, they can be forgiven because they don't appreciate the recategorization in terms of which tax bands are being applied and the like.
I appreciate that taxation is a specialized area, and not everyone understands it, and you cannot blame them for not understanding what the issues are. Now, previously, we used to have a situation where we had up to about 55.5% of taxes applying to phones, because we had the import declaration taxes, we had VAT, we had excise, and we had, of course, the income tax bit. So all this put together, about 55.5%. And they were paid at the point of entry. Okay? Now, the bill proposes that all these taxes are going to be collapsed into one, right? So that it is charged at the point of activating the phone, 25%. No. So the government is actually reducing, the taxes by up to 30.5%, making it easier for these young people to access those funds. So just as I said, we are in a partisan political environment, and whatever has been purveyed to the young people is not correct. The reality is that it's actually coming down.
There's a lot of misinformation.
Yes, that is true.
Wow. Such great perspective from Professor Vincent Ongore, who's with us here at PolitiKali Konekted to really unpack the Finance Bill 2026. We've had all sorts of things about what this finance bill is and what it's not. But one thing he said here in this episode is that you either decide to listen to your politician and not read the finance bill, or read the finance bill for you. Participation either way is a must. So if this episode enlightened you, if you thought of someone while you are listening to this episode, tafadhali don't gatekeep. Share this episode. Make sure you like, subscribe. And if you have a question, by the way, Prof is with us in part 2, and you can ask your questions in the comment section. So see you in part 2, where we discuss so much more about the finance bill.